So Imam Busayri, in the first line, he's saying that my nafs is still on the stage of nafsul amaratu bisu. It's commanding me to evil. And it hasn't, because of its ignorance, taken heed of this warner, which is the warner of grey hairs and approaching old age. And then he says, وَلَا أَدَدْتُ مِنَ الْفِعْلِ الْجَمِيلِ قِرَى دَيْفًا أَلَامَ بِرَاسِي غَيْرَ مُحْتَشِمِ. He says, neither has my soul prepared some good deeds to welcome this guest that has settled on my head. So the metaphor that he's using here is that when you have a guest that comes to visit you, traditional hospitality dictates that you prepare food and drinks and what we call in Arabic diyafa for the guests. So the guest which he's describing is the guest of old age and the guest of him coming closer to returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he's saying, I've known this guest was coming because the grey hairs are here on my head, showing me that I'm about to die soon. But even though I knew that the guest was coming, I didn't prepare anything to serve the guest with, which would have been good deeds, prayers, fasting, charity, etc. Things that would get me closer to Allah, things that would allow me to earn the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I wasted my entire youth, I wasted my entire life doing things that were not getting me any closer to Allah. And then as the time was passing, I realized that now I'm old and I'm about to die. I don't have anything that I'm going to approach Allah with on Yawm al-Qiyamah that's going to save me from His punishment or save me from the hellfire. لو كنت أعلم إني ما أوقره كتمت سرا بدالي منه بالكتم. He said, if I had realized that I wouldn't be able to honor this guest, which is the grey hairs on my head, I would have concealed it with dye. I would have hidden the fact that I'm getting on in age. I would have pretended to be a young person still. This is just a metaphor that he's using, but essentially it's him regretting the fact that his youth was wasted and now his old age has come and he hasn't prepared for it. So he said, if I knew that I wasn't able to prepare for it, I would have hidden the fact that I'm at this age. But it's shameful for me now that I've reached this age and I don't have any good deeds to present to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The scholars differ as to the age in which you're considered to be old, shayb in Arabic. Shayb literally means grey hair, but we see people in their 30s and 40s with grey hairs. Even me, I'm starting to get some of mine. You can't see it because I'm wearing a hat. Allahu Akbar. So, some of the scholars say the age of shayb is in your 60s. It begins in your 60s. Some of them say it begins in your 50s. Some of them say when you're 40 and you've reached the height of your youth, anything after 40, now you're getting old and everything's declining. So it's like life is on the incline up until you hit 40. When you're 40, you're at the peak, and then everything after 40 now is the decline. And you're getting ready to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But our Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse in Senegal, he had an interesting thing that he said on a tafsir of one of the ayahs of Quran. So there was an ayah in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا حَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَى لَعِبٌ وَلَهْوٌ وَزِينَةٌ وَتَفَاخُرُ بَيْنَكُمْ وَتَكَثُّرُ فِي الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَوْلَادِ. He describes subhanahu wa ta'ala the dunya as 5 different things. لَعِبٌ, games. وَلَهْوٌ, entertainment. وَزِينَةٌ, beautification. وَتَفَاخُرُ بَيْنَكُمْ, and then boasting amongst yourselves. وَتَكَثُّرُ فِي الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَوْلَادِ, and then trying to gather as much wealth and children as possible. So when Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse was given the tafsir of this ayah, he says, the human being transforms every 7 years. And so every 7 years you enter a new stage of life. He says, so when Allah speaks about the la'ibun, the games, that's the first 7 years of a person's life. Because up until the age of 7, when you're a child, you're not doing anything except playing. You're running around, you're talking to people, you're smiling. We have Hassan here, he's 3. You know, he's in that stage where nothing's really serious in life. He's not studying, he doesn't have bills, he doesn't have a degree, he doesn't have a mortgage to pay, he's not doing anything, he's just enjoying himself. So the first 7 years, it's just games. Because you know a game, You entertain yourself, you have fun, etc. Then when the game's over, you put the game to the side and nothing's really changed in life. Maybe you've developed some skills, you've entertained yourself, etc. But nothing's really too serious at that stage. So Sheikh Ibrahim said, the games, is the first 7 years. Then comes lahu. Lahu means entertainment. So from 7 to 14, that's the age of entertainment. That's when you start to get into films, into movies, into going out to play with your friends, socializing, etc. Still, it's not that serious. And then you get to 14, and puberty sets in. Then you get to the third stage, zinatun, beautification. That's when you start to see, as a boy, you know when you're like 10, you're not thinking about your clothes, you're not thinking about your trainers, you just want to have fun with your friends, go out, play games, kick a ball, climb a tree, throw a slingshot, play a video game. Now the kids don't even do that, they just play video games. But when you reach 14 now, that's when you start to, I want to get these new trainers. I want to start dressing a certain way. You start to look at the opposite sex and what you can do to attract a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or you start talking to people. For girls, when you're 14, that's when you start to get into makeup and doing your hair and doing all these different things. And essentially, that lasts until you're 21. Your whole teenage years, it's just about you thinking about the opposite sex and how to attract them and beautifying yourself and making yourself the most attractive you can be. And then when you get to the age of 21, life starts to get a bit more serious, and that's when you enter the fourth stage, tafakhiru bainakum. You start to now try to compete with everybody. Oh, I've just graduated. Oh, I've got my degree. Oh, I've got this graduate job. Oh, okay, I'm trying to climb the career ladder. Oh, I've started this company. Oh, I've started this business. I have this app. And you know, you're comparing yourself to the people your age. So between 21 and 28, you're looking to build yourself in the world. You're looking to, you know, push into the world and have your identity and become the person that you want to become and be the most successful you can be. And that gets you from 21 to 28, and then after 28, you start to think about now settling down, getting married, having kids, and building wealth. When you're 28, that's the time you start to think, okay, I need to get a mortgage now. Maybe you were renting that penthouse in Canary Wharf for a minute, or you had the flat in Westminster for a minute and you were living nice. And when you get to around 28, you start to think, okay, I should settle down. I should start to look for someone. I should start to get a mortgage. I should start to have kids. I need to make more financially responsible decisions, etc. You maybe think about investing. You maybe start doing things. And so that's when you get to that final stage of takathur fil amwali wal awlad. So that takes you to around 35. Then he says, so if by the age of 35, you haven't started to think seriously about life and returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and taking your life seriously at that stage, then you're definitely a loser by that stage. Because you'll just be continuing that cycle of beautifying yourself, climbing the social ladder, and you get to 35 and you realize you've wasted your youth. If you don't start to make a decision now to say, I'm going to return to Allah. Some people are blessed that they're able to do that before that age. But when Sheikh Ibrahim was giving the tafsir, he was saying essentially, by the time you reach 35, you have to start getting serious. You've passed through all of the 5 stages of the dunya now. You realize what it's about, and you should, by this stage, realize that the dunya is not really worth anything in reality. And your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is worth more than anything. And Imam Busayri, maybe because he has grey hairs by this stage, he's realizing it later than 35. And so he's regretting the fact that he wasted his entire life up to this stage. And so he says, من لي برد الجماح من غوايتها كما يرد الجماع الخيل في اللجوم. He says, so who is it that can help me to restrain my nafs and put reins on it in the same way that a wild horse is restrained by reins? Anyone that knows about, for example, horses, you know the Arabs, mashallah, horses were such a big part of their culture. Until today, horses are a big part of their culture. And you know, when you ride horses, etc., you have wild horses and you have domesticated horses. A wild horse, nobody can ride it, nobody can tame it. It goes where it wants, it does what it wants. If you come close, it will kick you. It eats what it wants, etc. And so there's a whole process of training the horse and domesticating the horse to the point that the horse now obeys you and you can ride it and take it to wherever you want it to go. And the nafs is the same. In the early stages of the nafs, and nafsul amara wa nafsul lawama, the nafs is going wherever it wants, doing whatever it wants. It wants to drink this, it wants to eat that, it wants to do this, it wants to do that. But now Imam Busayri is saying, who's it that's going to help me to restrain my nafs so that I can use it to be a tool that will take me back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I can use it to be a tool that will allow me to reach the stage that I want to reach. That's why Shaykh Ibrahim Yes again, he explained the nafs, and he says the nafs is like a wild horse. He says, but if you tame it, it can become the buraq that takes you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and returns you to the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's just about training it. And so Imam Busayri is asking, who is it that's going to help me restrain my nafs in the same way that a wild horse is restrained by reins? And then now he starts to give advice to the reader or to the listener on how to restrain the nafs. And the nafs, there are only 4 ways to restrain it. Shaykh Ibrahim Yes mentions in his tafsir. He says the nafs has 4 enemies, and each of those 4 enemies has 4 tools that you can use to combat the 4 enemies. The 4 enemies are the nafs itself, and the dunya, and hawa, which are your desires, your passionate desires, and shaitan, which is the devil. We all know shaitan. From all 4 of those enemies, shaitan is the weakest one. We always like to think shaitan is the strongest one. Anything that happens, we blame shaitan. But when Ramadan comes and shaitan is locked up and you're still wanting to do the things that you wanted to do outside of Ramadan, that's when you realize that the nafs was more evil and more powerful than shaitan. All shaitan can do is whisper. But it's up to the nafs to have the desire to do the action, and the hawa, your natural inclination and your desire, to push you to the action, and the dunya to engage with, to actually do the action. So all of these 3 are more troublesome than the nafs itself. So if you think than the shaitan himself. So if you think about it like this, there's a field, and then there's the animal in the field. The field is the dunya and your desires, and then the animal in the field is your nafs. And then you can either restrain it or let it go. But shaitan is just there in the side, encouraging you to do what you're doing in the dunya. So there's 4 enemies: nafs, dunya, hawa, and shaitan. Said, and then there's 4 cures to battle these 4. Qillatul ta'am, wa qillatul manam, wa qillatul qalam, wa qillatul anam. Qillatul ta'am, little eating very little. Not satiating all of your hunger all the time. Qillatul kalam, not speaking very much. Qillatul manam, not sleeping very much. Wa qillatul anam, and not mixing with the creation very much. So if you write the 4 enemies down on one side, and then you write the 4 cures down on the other side, and then I want you to now try and do the little cross puzzle to see which one deals with which one. That's your homework, inshallah. From the 4 enemies and then the 4 cures, which cure matches which enemy? So you've all written it down, yeah? The 4 enemies or the 4 cures? The 4 enemies are the nafs, and the dunya, and hawa, which are your desires, and shaitan. And then the 4 cures are qillatul ta'am, eating very little. Wa qillatul kalam, speaking very little. Wa qillatul manam, sleeping very little. Wa qillatul anam, and not mixing with people too much. Essentially isolation, uzla or khalwa. And so Imam Busayri then starts to give advice to how you can restrain your nafs. Because he's realizing that all of the problems that he had been facing in terms of not preparing good deeds for his old age, all sprung from the fact that he was following his desires for the entirety of his youth. So now he's trying to rein in the horse of his nafs and ride it as his buraq that will take him back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the rein that he's going to use to rein in his nafs is the following. He says, فَلَا تَرُمْ بِالْمَعَاسِ كَسْرَ شَهْوَتِهَا إِنَ التَّآمُ يُقَوِّي الشَّهْوَةِ النَّهِمِ. He says, do not try to get rid of your desires by indulging in them. Because if you're a greedy person, eating is only going to increase your greed. You know they have this saying in the West, get it out of your system. When you want to do something bad, they say, yeah, you know, you're young, just get it out of your system now, so that when you're old, you won't be inclined to do it anymore. So if you like to drink, yeah, just drink now. Get it out of your system. Do everything you want to do now so that you can get serious when you're older. Imam Busayri is saying, no, don't do that. Because if you're somebody, for example, that you like to eat, the more you eat, you're just going to want to eat more and you're just going to become greedy. This indulging in the sins in order to stop your desire for the sins is not going to stop your desire for the sins. It's just going to increase your desire for the sins because you enjoy it and you're going to be enjoying it as you're doing it. So it will do the opposite of what you think it's going to do. But this is from the tricks of the nafs and the tricks of the shaitan to get you to do these things. He's saying the real cure is وَالنَّفْسُ كَالْطِفْلُ, that the nafs is like a child. إن تحمل شب على حب الرضا وإن تحتم ينفتمي. He said the nafs is like a child. If you keep breastfeeding your child, the child will never stop breastfeeding. But when you stop breastfeeding your child and you start to give it food, that's when the child will now incline towards eating and forget about breastfeeding. When a child is young, 4 months, 5 months, sometimes even up to 6 months, and you're still breastfeeding them, they'll be breastfeeding. If you keep giving the child breast milk until 2 years old, sometimes you see these like Jerry Springer style shows where there's a 10-year-old child that's still breastfeeding because the mother never stopped the child when the child wanted to breastfeed. But when you reach 1 or 2, the recommended age in the Quran is 2, and then you start to say, no, I'm going to start feeding you proper food now. The child doesn't even realize, but over time it even forgets about breastfeeding and it starts to eat and it wants to start eating and doing things. So Imam Busayri is saying the nafs is exactly like that. If you allow your nafs to indulge in sins, it will continue to get used to sins. But if you start to try and restrain your nafs and replace the sins with good deeds, eventually the nafs starts to grow up and transform, and it will switch over to good deeds and leave the sins. But don't try and indulge the nafs and say, I'm going to get it out of my system and do it so that I don't want to do it anymore. Just stop doing it. Cold turkey. Try your best to stay away. Slowly, slowly. It will be difficult in the beginning, but then after a while, you will be able to make the switch. And so Imam Busayri is saying, النَّفْسُ كَالْطِفْلُ, that the nafs is like a child. أن تحملوا شب على حب الرضا وإن تفتموا ينفتمي. That the child will eventually become weaned off breast milk in the same way your nafs will become weaned off bad deeds and start to perform good deeds. And then he says, فَاصْرِفْ هَوَاهَا وَحَذِّرْ أَن تُوَلِّيَهُ إِنَ الْهَوَى مَا تَوَلَّ الصَّمُّ أَوْ يَسِمِ. He says, and then go against its desires and do not give it power. Do not entrust your affairs to it. A wali is somebody who you entrust your affairs to that person to do it for you. So you know, for example, when a woman is getting married, they say, where's your wali? The wali is the person that the wife has now chosen to represent her in the marriage contract. So the contract is between the husband and the wali. The wife sends the wali to do the job on her behalf. So he's saying, don't depend on your nafs to do what you want to be done. Because the nafs will always do what it wants to do. It will never do what it's supposed to do. So if you choose your nafs as a friend, as an ally, and you say, okay, I'm going to follow my desires, the nafs will start to lead you to do things that goes against what's good for you and goes against your better judgment. So he's saying, always oppose your nafs. If your nafs, you look at it and it wants to do something, do the opposite. If it's Fajr time, your nafs wants to sleep, get up and don't follow it. If you see that cheeky piece of cheesecake and your nafs wants to eat it, no, don't eat it. If you see that thing that, always tempts you and you know that you're not supposed to be doing it, don't follow your nafs and do it. Just stay away from it and don't do it. Obviously, it's easier said than done, but it's something that comes with practice. It's not something that you're going to wake up and be able to do instantly. Because when you entrust your nafs, when you trust your nafs, it's either going to poison you or kill you. Whatever it controls, it either pollutes it or it destroys it. Your nafs is never going to push you to do something that's good for you. It's always going to push you to do things that are bad for you. And so if you allow your nafs to have control over how you behave, your nafs will lead you to things that are going to pollute you or eventually kill you. And this might not even be a physical death, but it's a spiritual death. It will kill your soul. It will kill your alaqah with Allah. It will kill your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if you keep allowing it to indulge in what it likes to do. وَرَائِهَا وَهِيَ فِي الْأَعْمَالِ سَائِمَةٌ وَإِنْ هِيَ أَسْتَحَلَّتْ مَرْعُ لَا فَلَا تَسِمِي. He says, and then guard it as it grazes in the fields of actions. So remember we spoke about the actions earlier and the dunya as like a wide field. There's even a hadith to this effect in the Arba'in al-Nawawi, the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi, when the Prophet ﷺ says, al-halal bayin wal-haram bayin, that halal is clear and haram is clear. He says, and then in between halal and haram, there's mutashabihat, there's areas that are not too clear, gray areas. He says, but you should stay away from the gray areas because it's like somebody who they're grazing their animal in a field and they reach the boundary between their field and the neighboring person's field. If you're grazing in the area that you know clearly is yours, you're not going to have any problems. But if you come to the boundary and you're pushing the limits and then your animal is there grazing on the boundary, it will eventually go into the other person's field. So it's the same thing with the nafs. The things that you know that are clearly halal and clearly good for you, just stay in that vicinity. And then the things that you know are bad for you, keep them further away. Then when you get to the gray areas that are close, when you know that you could slip, where you know that you could fall into temptation, restrain your nafs from going towards those gray areas rather than pushing your nafs to indulge in those gray areas. Because once you start indulging in the gray areas, it's not long before you're over in the other field and you didn't even realize that you're over in the other field. And so his advice is, restrain the nafs when it's grazing in the field of actions. And when it's grazing, even if it's enjoying the grass, don't let it roam freely. And this is what they call in Islam wara. So wara means, how can you translate wara into English? There's one of these olden day words that they translate it as, but I forgot what the word was. But wara essentially means being careful. So for example, there's things that are clearly halal and there's things that are clearly haram. There's things that they're a bit doubtful, or even if you indulge in them, there could be a bit too much. But through you not wanting to go into the haram or into something that displeases Allah, you restrain yourself. So you have scrupulousness, it's called wara, scrupulousness. And this is a trait of the awliya, this is a trait of the friends of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they're very scrupulous in their actions, that they make sure that they always try and do the things that are the best or the things that are the most pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so he's saying, even if your nafs is enjoying certain things, don't let your nafs run freely. And why? Kam hasanat lazzatul lil mar'i qatilatan min haythu lam yadri anna summa fi dasami. Said, because how many times have we seen the example of someone that's enjoying something that eventually kills them because they do not know that there was poison in fat.